Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Climate change, there was a huge amount of discussion about it, but it was often very zoomed in. It was people looking at specific technologies, people looking at specific cultural elements, all these different things. But there was very little, very broad perspective. So we wanted to set out to ask these 4 questions. So where are we at with climate change? Have we made any progress yet? What solutions do and don't work? Once you understand what needs to be done, what are the barriers to action, to achieving those goals? And finally, what does it mean for what we should do? So firstly, how are we doing solving climate change? To talk about that, I want to start by showing you the world's most boring graph. Any scientist in the room will spot this as an exponential curve. An exponential curve is what you get when you have a steady rate of acceleration. Now look at carbon emissions produced by humankind. That includes all the oil, coal, and gas, but also all the deforestation and land use change over the last 150 years, 160 years, in fact. If you put those 2 things together, then what you find is that they're a very, very close match. Now, there are all sorts of deviations along the way. You've got the First World War here. You've got the Great Depression. You've got the Saudi oil fields coming on stream in the 1950s and 60s. You've got the first oil crisis, the second oil crisis. There's the invasion of Kuwait up there. So roughly speaking, we're talking about an exponential trend. Now, this tells you 2 things. Firstly, it tells you that there's something of a feedback loop in the way that we use energy, because energy is behind most of these emissions. The other thing it tells you, if you zoom in to the last 10 years, is that in the last 10 years, there's been absolutely no deviation from that long-term trend. So for everything that's happened on clean energy, for everything that's happened on efficiency and population growth and all these other things, none of it seems to have made a blind bit of difference to the total amount of CO2 we've emitted. So what does it mean? If we stay on that curve, I mean, we've been on it for 160 years, so the obvious question is, what happens if we fail to come off it? Now, what you can see there is that's the temperature rising up through the last 150 years. There's the increase observed in my lifetime, so about 0.6 degrees. Now, if we keep it on the curve, then basically the temperature will rise somewhere in that orange cone. Now, we can't say exactly where in the cone because we can't be sure how sensitive the climate is to CO2 emissions. But if we stay on it, look at the range of possibilities. So by the time I'm retired, we're talking about up to 2.3 degrees Celsius. By the time I reach the end of my likely life expectancy, that would be up to 3.7 degrees. Someone born today, I've got a child due in 2 months, so by the time that child reaches the end of its life, then we could be looking at 6.3 degrees. On the other hand, it could be much lower, 2.7 degrees. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that we're going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, 4 degrees doesn't sound like a great deal. It's the difference between a warm day and a slightly warmer day. But if you put it in geological history, then you realize it's actually a massive change. So 4 degrees is approximately the same increase that we've had globally since the last glacial maximum. And that is the scientific phrase for the extent of the last big push of the Ice Age. So as most people in this room will know, we're actually aiming for 2 degrees. That's the target that the world's community, pretty well every government in the world, minus perhaps Qatar, has agreed that we should sign up for. But it's very important to understand that 2 degrees is not safe in any particular sense. So the target emerged based on science from the 1990s. In 2001, the EU said this is the target we should be aiming for. Unfortunately, in the interim, science changed quite a lot. We had another 15 years of data to look at things like ice melt and all the rest of it. And so actually, the science started looking a bit more scary. In 2001, this is the column to look at, the risk of large-scale discontinuity. In other words, the risk of it all going terribly wrong. The 2-degree line there is pretty well in the white. The risk of a large-scale discontinuity is very low. Now, by 2009, you can see that this orange and red has come down a long way, and actually we're now firmly into an uncomfortable territory there, even at 2 degrees. This shows us the key point to understand about carbon emissions, which is that it doesn't matter who emits what and when. It doesn't matter whether country X cuts by 3% relative to date Y. What matters is the total amount of CO2 that we as a species emit. Now, this kind of boils it down to the key numbers you need to understand. 2,000 billion tons of CO2, that's what we've emitted in human history, so that's since 1750. Now, if we want to stay within that 2-degree range, then we can emit roughly, not quite as much, but almost as much as we've emitted so far if we're prepared to accept 50-50 odds of crossing that line. If we want better odds, which I think would certainly be easier to explain to our children, we might want to limit ourselves to about 700 billion tons. So that gives us a 75% chance of success. Now, if you look at that, your first thought might be, well, it doesn't look too bad because we can emit almost everything we've emitted so far, and that took the best part of 300 years. Unfortunately, if you put this in the context of that exponential trend I showed you before, things look very different indeed. That's what it looks like for the 75% chance of success. So you might think, OK, well, forget the better odds. Let's have 50-50 odds. Unfortunately, it doesn't make that much difference. As you can see here, it's the best possible scenario that any policymaker could bear to imagine, peaking global emissions in about 2020. We're still looking at coming down the slope even faster than we went up. OK, but we can't just keep going up that trend forever because there's going to be a constraint in the form of oil, coal, and gas reserves. Well, this is what happens if you add up the oil, the coal, and the gas, the carbon that they contain, and the CO2 that would be produced if all that carbon was burned. If you compare that to the two budgets I showed before, it makes it pretty clear that we can only burn about half of the carbon in the proven fossil fuel reserves if we want a 50-50 chance of success. Unfortunately, that's only proven reserves, which anyone who works in the fuel industry in here will know means the carbon reserves which the company that owns them can say with a 90% certainty will be burned. Now, of course, what's been happening in the last 10 years is that the big story in energy hasn't been about conventional proven fossil fuel reserves. It's been about the emergence of these alternative fossil fuels, such as shale oil, shale gas, tar sands, heavy oil, coal bed methane, and the rest of it. If you add all those on to look at the technically recoverable fossil fuel reserves, you see that actually we can only burn a tiny proportion of what's left in the ground. And even if you could magically just get rid of all the coal, you'd see that even just the oil and the gas, there's more than double what we can burn. So in order to solve climate change, we either need to leave most of this fossil fuel in the ground, or we need to burn it only when we understand how to get the carbon back out of the air and into the ground. It really is as simple as that. But that's obviously a global challenge. So how's the global politics doing? Well, this shows carbon emissions going up and up, the top line. If the next line down shows what would happen to global emissions if all the current pledges made by governments about cutting carbon are achieved. And even if it happened, this graph is a little bit optimistic, because if you don't burn the fuel in one place, it doesn't mean it won't get burnt elsewhere. So what solutions are going to help keep all that fossil fuel in the ground? I want to just look at 4. So one of the many ways that you can cut up CO2 emissions would be to say that CO2 is a result of the number of people there are, times the amount of GDP that each person creates, times the energy that we use to create each unit of GDP, times the carbon that's emitted for each unit of energy. Now, that's just one way of breaking this up, but it's one that's popularly used. Well, reducing population growth, we hear a lot about that, and you can see the black line there, population's been going up and up, but actually the percent increase in population, the gray line, has been going down very, very steeply. But that begs the question, how come, if population growth has slowed right down, why hasn't emissions growth slowed down? It suggests that actually the relationship between the two, they don't move in lockstep, as you might assume. And actually, when you pause to think about it, that makes perfect sense, because what happens to drive populations to stop growing so fast? The overriding factor is they get richer. When populations get richer, they use more energy, and they have more carbon per person. So some people say, well, what about economic growth? If we could just level off GDP, then that would also level off carbon emissions. But that actually is a big leap of faith. No one can control GDP in any kind of direct way. It's a much better way to understand the relationship between GDP and energy to say that actually it's the energy that drives the GDP. It's not the GDP that drives the energy. So what this tells us is that actually even if we could find a way to level off GDP, it wouldn't necessarily have the effect that we expect. And not just that. People generally say that this is something we should do in rich countries, but rich countries now account for only about 1/3 of the total carbon emissions. So again, probably not the solution we need. Energy efficiency. This is the one that we hear a lot about. If we all just insulated our homes and we drove more efficient cars, then surely carbon emissions would come down and we'd be moving in the right direction. But what this graph here shows is that actually that's been happening anyway. The average amount of energy that it takes to produce a unit of GDP, the black line there, has been falling very steadily for at least 50 or 60 years. And in fact, the trend probably goes right back forever, which makes perfect sense because we're getting better technologies that allow us to use energy in a more sensible way. And yet, as I showed at the beginning, global carbon emissions have not slowed down at all. So somehow, all these energy intensity gains, all these efficiency benefits, are being lost. The concept that's often described as the rebound effect is coming in and cancelling out those benefits. That's the idea that if you make things more efficient, rather than using less energy, we just use more of everything. Now, the conventional way of thinking about this is to say, for example, that if you make electricity cheaper, then everyone will buy a bigger fridge. Simple as that. But that's only going to cancel out a few of the gains. But if you look at rebound effects in a more holistic way, you realize actually that it makes perfect sense that efficiency gains may not have the effect that you expect and could actually be counterproductive. So if everyone gets a more efficient car in the UK, there are only two things that can happen, really. Either we'll drive more because driving's got cheaper, or we're going to use less fuel. If people drive more, there's more demands for roads. It becomes a bit more feasible to live in suburbia. Suburban homes are bigger. Bigger homes take more energy to heat. So suddenly, by making cars more efficient, you are increasing the demand for natural gas. Or if you think some people don't cancel out the benefits that way, they use less fuel. Well, if they've used less fuel, then that means they have to have saved some money. If they've saved some money, what are they going to spend it on? Even if you just leave it in the bank will lend it to someone else who will then spend it on something. So one way or another, that money will be spent, and everything that we buy has a carbon footprint. So that will drive energy use. If we just made the world's energy mix cleaner, then surely we could just keep using as much energy as we want and cancel out the carbon emissions. Well, this graph shows actually we need to be a little bit cautious of that view because we've all seen over the years that there's been more solar, more wind. There's been, in some countries, more nuclear, in some countries, more hydro. And if you look at the world as a whole and you look at the amount of CO2, the black line there, that we produce for each unit of energy, what you realize is the trend has been very flat. And actually, it's been creeping back up since about 2000. And that, broadly speaking, the world's energy mix is about as dirty today as it was in 1980. Yes, we've added lots of renewables, 500 million tons of oil equivalent. That's a lot. Unfortunately, it's been completely cancelled out by the coal, the oil, and the natural gas, which we've added in much larger quantities. Couldn't we just have less of this as we have more of this? Wouldn't it be natural that each wind turbine we put up cancels out some coal, oil, and gas? That's the standard assumption. Back in 1850, here we are, powered almost entirely by wood, biomass. And over time, we start bringing coal on stream. Coal's a more powerful energy source than wood, so did we suddenly stop burning wood? No, of course we didn't. We just grew the economy more and kept burning wood as well. And then the oil came on stream. Surely that would mean we burn less coal, but no. What happens is that we get more oil and we also burn more coal. And then you've got the cleaner energy sources coming on top, the gas, the hydro, the nuclear, and that tiny line at the top, solar and wind. Again, the normal assumption is everything we add to those clean burning lines subtracts from that oil and coal line. But I don't think that's true at all. Actually, what seems to be happening when you look at it holistically is that we've got a feedback loop, like I mentioned at the beginning. Energy begets energy. The more energy we have, the more energy we're able to extract from all different sources. So we shouldn't assume that more clean energy means less dirty energy. So who's responsible for that fossil fuel use? Is it the end consumers? Is it me buying this laptop, which has a carbon footprint? Is it the industry? Is it Apple who produced the laptop? Or is it the company that takes the fossil fuel out of the ground? You can think of those three as being coupled together like the three carriages of a train. You can't slow down one without slowing down the other two. And so for the last 10, 20 years, we've heard a huge amount about the consumption end, about we're all just greedy Western consumers. If only we could just consume a bit less and be better people, then we would somehow cut the world's carbon. But actually, that's not going to work if the extraction carriage is still pushing it along from the back, because if the stuff's still coming out of the ground, one way or another, it's going to get burned. This is the conclusion that we really need to grapple with, that we can't minimize the consumption of fossil fuels and carbon footprints while we're maximizing the supply. This is just a quick case study. There's been lots of talk recently about, oh, don't worry, things are getting better. America's emissions are starting to fall finally because we've got more natural gas over there and more renewables, and so emissions are coming down. If you look at the extraction perspective, things look very different. As you can see, for all the talk of falling emissions, the amount of carbon that the American people have extracted has kept going up. The last year for which there's data, 2010, is the highest ever. So what's happened is that just through a historical quirk, America has no export facilities for gas, so it's artificially cheap there, and instead they're exporting the coal. And British emissions rose by 4% last year as a result of the world being flooded with all this cheap American coal. So what are the barriers to action? If we know that we need to leave most of this stuff in the ground, the first is the simple value of the stuff. So the reserves and all the infrastructure we've built to extract and burn them, we reckon are worth somewhere between $10 and $100 trillion. For reference, global GDP is about 70 trillion. And yet, what's happening is that even though these assets are already in danger of being written off if we were to solve climate change, then the fuel companies are still spending the best part of $1 trillion every year developing new reserves. Now, that is a really good example of cognitive dissonance, I think, that they are taking pension fund money, largely pension fund, and spending it, expanding reserves, even though collectively we've got far more than we can burn already. This also determines the global politics, thinking of it in terms of the value of the stuff in the ground. If you add up the carbon in the borders of Europe, Africa, and the small island states, the nations that have traditionally been seen as pushing hardest for a global carbon deal, you realize that they've only got about 5% of the total potential CO2. That rest of the world stack there, that is China, India, Russia, America, Canada, and the Middle East. That's where the carbon is, and by no coincidence, those nations have been significantly less helpful in arranging a global deal. The second barrier, the prioritization of economic growth above all other policy goals. If we make maximizing GDP our key political priority, then are we ever going to take those $10 to $100 trillion of fossil fuels and write them off? The answer is obviously no. So somehow or another, we need to get to the point where we are taking the threat to the planet as seriously as we're taking the threat to GDP of writing off fossil fuel reserves. There's a huge amount of social and psychological barriers to action. Just to give one example, optimism bias. There's a well-observed psychological trend that if you ask people all over the world in all different cultures and social classes, how are things going to turn out when the future is uncertain? We are incredibly rose-tinted as a species. Everyone thinks that they're going to live longer than average. Everyone thinks their kids are going to be more clever than average. Everybody thinks that they have a better chance than they really do of winning the lottery. Another one, social inertia bias, the idea that we tend to panic when other people panic. There's a famous social psychology experiment that says that when a fire alarm goes off in a building, then what people don't do is run out of the building. Instead, what they do is look in the next office and see if then that person is running out of the building. Finally, sharing the pie. We generally think of it as, bad country X isn't cutting its emissions by enough. But if you think of it in terms of carbon budgets, the whole global political process seems a bit different. If what you're saying is we can only burn a fifth of the world's fossil fuels, or a half, or whatever you decide it is, the process of those global talks, the purpose of them, is to say who gets what slice. And when you consider how important and valuable fossil fuel is, you realize that that is the greatest diplomatic challenge that humanity surely has ever faced. No matter which sort of neat policy you pick, if every nation decides it wants to get as much as possible of that remaining carbon pie, then there can be no agreement. Someone is going to have to take a lead and give in a little bit. So what should we do? Waking up. I mean, we think that basically the whole discussion around climate change has tended to be framed in terms of, if we all just cycle a bit more, we'll all be a bit cooler, or if we insulate our homes, we'll have more green jobs. And a lot of those arguments have something for them, but they don't get to the core problem, which is we need to get off this fossil fuel. We need to start telling that as the story. Capping the carbon. Obviously, that's the really big challenge. How do we set a cap and say we're not going to exceed this budget? Things like divesting from fossil fuel companies. It's not going to make any difference to their bottom line, but it starts to shift the debate towards where it needs to be, focusing on the fossil fuels and focusing on the now unavoidably moral dimension of fossil fuel extraction. Trade policy. Is it time now, if we're in the UK and we don't really have much fossil fuel left, is it time for us to start saying to America and China and others, well, we're only going to import your goods if they come with some effort to cut carbon. Special interests. Fossil fuel companies currently spend $1 billion a year just in America to lobby politicians and to fund their campaigns. Pushing all useful technologies. People talk a lot about renewables. Some people say nuclear is the answer. I think the thing that's been most overlooked is carbon capture in all its forms. And that's because it's not only something which promises to ease the challenge, because the more carbon capture we have, the less fuel we need to write off. It also has a kind of geopolitical rationale, which is that if, say, the UK has managed to successfully make carbon capture work and make it cheap, then we can much more realistically say to America and China, let's kind of start moving to a solution that doesn't mean you writing off all your coal reserves. We need to buy some time, and we can do that by doing things like worrying about methane and soot, these fast-acting gases. All they do, sorting out those, just buys us some time. It just pushes the temperature peak a bit away. And finally, leadership. You can think of human society as being like a complex system, just like the climate. And the reason the climate complex system is scary is because we know we can push it within bounds, but if we push it too far, it could flip to a new state. That's what complex systems do. But human society, 7 billion people, that is also a complex system. And the question is, for the next 50 years, what's going to tip first? Is it going to be the climate tipping out of control, or is it going to be the human response to that crisis? And leadership of all its forms, whether it's individuals taking action, or whether it's companies taking action, or whether it's pension funds having a more sensible conversation with fossil fuel companies, all of those, we think, can help move us towards a tipping point in the human response.
Are you too pessimistic? Does anything recently make you think that things might be slightly better than your exponential curve suggests?
To answer your question in two parts, so the first part, the UK, is that relevant? I think it's not particularly relevant given that almost all our heavy industry closed down in the UK and we now import everything from China and elsewhere. So the fact that we consume less energy here is not particularly relevant given that we still rely on the energy being burnt elsewhere. And also given that we are still maximizing the fossil fuel we take out. So if every country maximizes what it takes out, then you can be sure that at the global level, once all the trading's happened, all that fuel will be burned. So the real question is, how do we get on top of that extraction? Has anything made me feel more optimistic recently? There was a report by the Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency which said that last year, for the first time, we actually only saw emissions grow by 1.1% from fossil fuels, even though the economy grew by 3.5%. And that did make me more optimistic, although when I found myself writing about it and trying to get to the bottom of the data, I found that actually the economy didn't grow by 3.5%. That was based on a preliminary assumption. It actually grew something more like 2%. So it had been a big cut in GDP growth and only slightly bigger cut in carbon growth. And then I saw that there'd been a spike in deforestation, which meant that actually overall we were still bang on the long-term trend. That quickly shattered any optimism that I felt.